Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're going to discuss the sad story of segregated America. And specifically, we're going to talk about boycotting buses and a Birmingham jail. And along the way, we're going to meet a Georgia preacher. We're going to talk about protests. We're going to find the strength to love. We're going to see a lot of flags. We're going to visit a city called Bombingham, and we're going to listen to a letter. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head, so put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we continue to build an answer to that question on the lower left. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. succeed when others did not? What exactly was Jim Crow? What were the earlier strategies that fought it? Were King's tactics substantially different? How was the nation substantially different? Or was King just the collective accumulation of the long decades of the civil rights struggle? Why did King change the country in a way that previous civil rights leaders did not? Okay, a quick recap. In 1954, the NAACP won its greatest legal victory, Brown versus the Board of Education. In a surprise unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court actually reverses its 1896 Plessy ruling. Racial segregation in schools was ruled unconstitutional, and public schools in the South were told to integrate with all due haste. But in 1955, many people were growing increasingly dissatisfied with the NAACP's kind of go-it-slow legal approach. They wanted a more activist demolition of Jim Crow, and this included parts of the NAACP, specifically the chapter located in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, the civil rights people in Montgomery, Alabama pointed out that the entire segregation thing started with public transportation. It started with the Plessy case back in 1896, and the Brown decision overturned Plessy. Therefore, public transportation should be desegregated, and they planned to do this in Montgomery, Alabama. So, on December 1st, 1955, the secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, there she is right up above me, Rosa Parks, she boards a city bus and sits down, and when she's asked to give up her seat for a white man, she refused. She is, of course, arrested. But this is all going according to plan. They know she's going to be arrested. Now, this was all planned out. It was planned out by this sort of loose coalition of civil rights activists, including the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, because they're going to use her arrest to force the desegregation of the bus system. Her arrest would then be followed by a bus boycott, and they had already selected the figurehead of their boycott, a Georgia preacher recently arrived from Atlanta, and his name was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he's only 26 when this gets started. This becomes the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks is arrested. They say you must release her and desegregate the bus system. The city officials of Montgomery, Alabama refuse, and the African Americans of the entire city launch a bus boycott. Now, the civil rights leaders knew that most of the people who actually used the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama were black. And the boycott would be both highly visible and it would economically cripple the bus system. One of the ironies of this, segregated bus system is that it placed African Americans in a subordinate position on those buses, but the buses were largely paid for by African Americans. Don't forget, the ultimate point of Jim Crow is to economically suppress and exploit African Americans in the South. Now, so they knew that the bus boycott would be visible and it would economically cripple the bus system. So for day after day, you saw pictures like that. Long lines of African Americans choosing to walk to work rather than take the racist bus system. For day after day, African Americans walked to work. They took cheap taxis. They carpooled. And the key was holding the African American community together. This had been very hard to do in the past. So the civil rights leaders held weekly meetings in churches where speeches and sermons were given to hold the community together. If the African Americans could stick together, they knew eventually they could force the integration of the Montgomery bus system. And this is the moment where the charisma and passion of Martin Luther King began to be seen. He possessed a golden voice, a brilliant mind, an unshakable will. And all of this was combined together with his deep, deep sense of Christian justice. He would give these weekly sermons. There you can see it right up above me. Giving these sermons about how we have to stick together, why we're doing this in the first place. We've got to keep the people together. We've got to keep people unified in the cause of the boycott. And the voice of Martin Luther King begins to extend beyond the African American community, because the civil rights leaders in Montgomery, Alabama began to receive secret packages. Sympathetic white members of the community began to subsidize the bus boycott because they can't speak out publicly against Jim Crow because they will be beaten and ruined. But they can, under the table, support King and the civil rights movement and the Montgomery bus boycott. And the goal of all of this is to hold the boycott together until the Montgomery system relented. The boycott lasted a month, 2 months, 4 months, 8 months. A year passed with the African Americans refusing to use the bus system. Eventually, the Montgomery city officials send in the police. Montgomery police even arrest Dr. King at one point. But the thing is, he hasn't actually done anything. He hasn't actually done anything illegal. Giving weekly sermons is not illegal. Refusing to ride a bus is not illegal. They basically arrest him on these trumped up charges. And, King quite visibly says, I am proud of my crime because he has committed no real crime other than offending the racist sensibilities of the Jim Crow South. After an astounding 381 days of boycott, the city of Montgomery relented. They had actually lost a related court case, so they knew that the segregation of the city buses was illegal. They had lost the court of public opinion. Most of the white people in Montgomery, Alabama now supported the bus boycotters. The nation itself was in support of the bus boycotters, and the city bus system had lost upwards of $1 million. All right. King and his fellows desegregated the bus system in the South, and Martin Luther King had succeeded where Governor Pinchback, all the way back in 1896, had not. This was a massive victory. It's so weird to see Martin Luther King Jr. young. Anyway, this was a massive victory, and King rapidly began to be seen as the leader of the newborn activist civil rights movement. Now, this rankled some of the older leaders, and it particularly annoyed the NAACP because, again, they say we need to stick to this go-it-slow approach legal strategy. That's what won us the court case in Kansas in 1954, and that's what ultimately will destroy Jim Crow. King says, no, civil disobedience can do it, and do it quicker and better. So in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott, King and his fellow activists created a new organization to operate independently of the NAACP. They combined together with white evangelicals, including Billy Graham, and they formed a new organization that was to be called, all caps, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Now, the SCLC was organized around defeating Jim Crow through a specifically Christian approach. They were independent of the NAACP, although they would work with it, and they would remain highly critical of it. The SCLC elected as its first president Martin Luther King. They immediately began to plan a new approach towards defeating Jim Crow. They selected as a site of protest a city in the South that many considered to be the most racist city in America at the time, Birmingham, Alabama. But before we actually address what happened in Birmingham and why Birmingham really matters and how Birmingham unfolded, we actually have to pause for a moment and talk about their approach towards defeating Jim Crow and talk about how actually protesting works in America. Now, protests in and of themselves do not actually do anything. Protests in and of themselves don't change a thing. What protests do is attract attention. if they are large enough and if they are energetic enough, a protest will capture the attention of the nation. But that's not enough. Once that attention is present, then the protesters make their argument to the entire country. And it's the argument that matters in the end, not the protest itself. For example, I'll give you a protest that worked, and I'll give you a protest that failed. Okay, in 1968 and 1969, there were massive protests against the war in Vietnam. There they are, these huge protests. Again, all a protest does is attract the attention of the nation. So you have these huge anti-war protests, they attract the attention of the nation. Then the anti-war activists made their argument. And their argument against the war in Vietnam was very simple. They argued that the war was unnecessary. They argued that the war was being badly fought. They argued that the war was really just an internal civil war inside Vietnam and that America should not be involved. This was a compelling argument, and it carried the day. And after 1968, America doesn't talk about winning the Vietnam War. They talk about leaving. This can be contrasted with the anti-war protests in 2003 and 2004 against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Now, these protests, there they are, no blood for oil. These protests were actually larger than the protests in 1968, and they were more energetic than the protests in 1968. They captured the focus of the American nation. But they had no argument other than just, the platitude, war is bad. And President George Bush was able to counter this. He had built a compelling case for military action against Iraq. The Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, possessed weapons of mass destruction, principally poison gas, and he had sought to build an atomic bomb. That was true. Saddam Hussein possessed ties with existing terrorist groups. That was true. And that the existing efforts to unseat Saddam Hussein for a decade previous had all proved unsuccessful. That again was true. Despite being large, despite being vocal, despite being energetic, the anti-war protests in 2003 and 2004 failed. They failed because they had no cogent argument. In fact, most protest movements actually accomplish very little. Most protests fail, and they fail because once they attract attention, they have no consistent ideology and they have no cogent argument. I mean, there we go. The largest protest in Washington, D.C. in American history occurred in 2017. The women's protest in Washington, D.C. And they marched, and they wore pink hats, and they waved placards, and they captured the attention of the nation, and they had no argument. Other than being kind of vaguely anti-Trump, there was no coherent argument made by the women's protest. The protest failed. It accomplished nothing. And despite the fact that it was only a few years ago, I mean, it's almost been entirely forgotten about. The protest failed. And the first people who use violence always lose. Keep that in mind. Protests are about convincing the rest of the country about the rightness of your argument. And if they see images like this, images of fists, images of fire, the country will reject your argument out of hand. So, when Dr. King and the SCLC select Birmingham, they build a coherent ideology. They build a compelling argument before the protests begin, before they decide to roll into town. Which is why we're going to pause for a second and examine the argument and the tactics of Dr. King and the SCLC. We're going to talk about their tactics, which are just as important as their ideology. First off, King's philosophy held at its core that America was a good country and that Americans were good people. Most Americans, Dr. King thought, were not actually racist. They simply needed to be shown the ugliness and sinfulness of segregation, and showing them this would cause them to tear down Jim Crow. King's approach was based on his fervent Christianity, which led him to love the sinner. If racism was a sin, then King argued that it is the Christian duty of every Christian to love the racists that hated them. And he puts all of this together in this slender little book, The Strength to Love. So when they go out and protest and people say, what is your argument? They can just point to the book. And this is what Martin Luther King Jr. writes in A Strength to Love. I always feel awkward reading King's words, but just indulge me for a second. This is what King writes back in 1963. To our most bitter opponents, we say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. Throw us in jail, and we shall love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we shall still love you. He's talking about the Klan. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. You have to find the strength to love, and you have to love the racists that hate you. Also, this was combined with a really adroit set of tactics, things that the protesters themselves were supposed to do during this big protest. And first among these was, all caps, non-violence, all right? The protesters were to not resist. The protesters were to not defend themselves. And if you are beaten, if you are attacked, let yourself be beaten, all right? Their ability to endure suffering exceeds the racists' ability to do them harm. Now, King was strongly influenced by two political philosophers. The early 19th century transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the original book on civil disobedience back in the 1840s, and the campaigner for self-rule in India, Mahatma Gandhi. Both of these guys had written on the virtue of pacifism and nonviolent civil disobedience. The goal here is to morally shame one's oppressor into giving up the oppression. But it depends that your oppressors have to be good people, all right? But it was also a lot of little tactics as well. As King and the SCLC organized their protests, this is what they would tell people. Show up in your best clothes. Show up in your Sunday best. Again, Dr. King knew this was about winning the argument. This was about changing minds. The protesters had to look good. They had to look very formal. They had to look very serious. And you look at these images of these civil rights protests, and if the people in these images look like really dapper, very well dressed, it's because it's because they wanted to look well dressed. They were asked to wear their Sunday best. And you see these guys, they're wearing church robes, they're wearing suits and ties, they're wearing three-piece suits. They are told to look as good as possible because, again, they have to change the mind, even of the racists that will show up and attack them. And smiling, always smiling. The civil rights movement was to be a positive movement. Smile. They were fixing the country. They had the Constitution on their side. They had the law on their side. They were bringing public opinion over to their side. And in the end, they have God Almighty himself on their side. Why wouldn't you smile? Which is why when you see these pictures of Martin Luther King and pictures of these protesters, they're smiling. They're always smiling. They're smiling for the camera. They're smiling for the people that hate them because they're trying to win over not just public opinion, but they're trying to win the hearts of the people who hate them. Love the sinner. And flags. Oh my goodness. So many flags. Like so many flags. And once somebody points this out to you, you can't not see it in pictures of all these protests. King and the SCLC wanted to repeat the message that the civil rights movement was pro-American. We're not these American-hating communists. The civil rights movement and the African Americans within it were just demanding the rights that had already been promised to them. They weren't opposing America. They were trying to make America better. So, Dr. King always tried to put a flag right behind him. He would see a reporter and tell the reporter to move because he wanted the reporter to take a picture of him, and behind him, the flag. All right? He would put veterans out in front of the march, and he would ask them to wear their medals, their campaign ribbons from World War II, their Purple Hearts, their Silver Stars. This was a pro-American movement. So many flags. Like so many flags. All right? King always wanted a flag nearby him. All right? He always wanted flags in and among the protesters. This was a pro-American movement. They had Abraham Lincoln on their side. They've got Thomas Jefferson on their side. They have the law. They've got the Constitution. They've got public opinion. Why not be pro-American? So, when they arrive at Birmingham in 1963, all of these elements are in place, all right? I mean, look at these guys right up above me. Non-violent civil disobedience. They're just going to walk down the street and disobey, all right? Christian pacifism. They're not going to fight with police. They're not going to resist. And again, look at them. All of them very well dressed. They've got hats, ties, suits. They are very well dressed. They are all smiling. They are carrying flags. They are marching down the street. They sing the national anthem. They're singing hymns. Every now and again, they'll stop and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, this is so wholesome, all right? And at this point, if the racists respond violently to this, at that point, who is being un-American? It's not the protesters. This is what they're going to bring to Birmingham. Now, Birmingham at the time was known as the most segregated city in the South and had a long history of racial oppression and violence. In fact, it was nicknamed Bombingham because the local Klan would use midnight dynamite, which would be lobbed at black homes and black churches. It was a stronghold of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama. And again, the old Dixiecrat racist Strom Thurmond had won this state by 79%. And Birmingham was the home to the Dixiecrats. And the city was in the grip of an avowed and ugly racist. Birmingham's brutal Commissioner for Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor. He was a Democrat. He had been a Dixiecrat back in 48. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Connor had consistently attacked civil rights activists. He had defied court orders. He had suppressed black votes. And he had defended segregation at every single step. And Bull Connor will be Martin Luther King's primary antagonist for the events that are about to unfold in Birmingham. So, 1963, King and the SCLC select Birmingham as the place to put these ideals into action. They organize large protests. They call for an end to segregation at businesses. They call for an end to segregation in public areas. They call for an end to segregation in hiring practices. And they call for the integration of Birmingham public schools. They march in the streets. They hold hands. They sing Christian hymns. They dressed nicely. They behaved very politely. They waved American flags. They sang hymns. They even recited the Pledge of Allegiance. They marched on the streets. They had little picnics where they invited people to come and eat with them. And at first it seemed to work. Like a lot of the businesses in downtown Birmingham, were willing to just cave right away. And a lot of the signs came down. Whites only, colored this, whites here. A lot of those signs came down right away. And then the police showed up and told those business owners to put those segregated signs back up because the police started threatening local business. Again, I want you to think back. Businesses actually really hate Jim Crow because they make everything more expensive. And then Bull Connor unleashed the police on the protesters. They attacked the protesters, blasting them with high-powered water hoses, powerful enough to blow the clothing off of the body. They beat the protesters with billy clubs. They unleashed German shepherds on the protesters, and the protesters did not fight back. And these pictures were taken, and the newsreels of every evening were showing the brutal Birmingham police beating these Christian pacifist protesters who were merely asking that their constitutional rights be given to them. They were merely asking the city of Birmingham to obey the law. 1,000 people were arrested on the first day. 1,600 people were arrested the next. All of the city jails filled up. And among the people that were arrested, this included local school children. Some as young as 10 years old. They are being arrested and sent to the Birmingham City Jail. The entire country's just jaw dropped open. They're like, why are you arresting these people? What law are these people actually breaking? Why are you arresting 10-year-old school children for reciting the Pledge of Allegiance on the sidewalk? All right. And Bull Connor could not actually explain why he was arresting anyone at all. In fact, when they finally cornered him and said, these people are not breaking the law, this is what Bull Connor said. Damn the law. Down here, we make our own law. All right, there's Bull Connor. And Bull Connor comes off just absolutely horrible. They interview him. They take his picture. He gives these quotes to reporters, and he's awful because Bull Connor is dumb. He's ignorant. He's fat. He's corrupt. He's racist. And he's violent. He just comes off as like the worst person imaginable. He doesn't obey his P's and Q's. I am not going to read that quote from Bull Connor there on the left. And I would say he is the personification of the dumb, racist, fat, corrupt Southern sheriff, except he's not. He's not the personification of that stereotype, but rather Bull Connor becomes the stereotype. Through the next 50 years in American popular culture, the entire country will mock Bull Connor for decades. Every time you're watching a movie and Buford T. Justice shows up, fat, stupid, violent, racist. It is just another caricature of Bull Connor. I mean, from Boss Hogg to J.W. Peppa, these are all the entire country mocking Bull Connor. He becomes a national object of fun and sport. And it would be humorous if the stakes weren't so incredibly high. Indeed, John F. Kennedy himself, who's president by the time we get to 1963, John F. Kennedy himself says, look, the civil rights movement ought to thank God for Bull Connor. He's helped it as much as Abraham Lincoln, because everyone looks at Bull Connor and how Bull Connor is acting and Bull Connor is behaving. No one wants to be on the same side as Bull Connor. Martin Luther King himself is arrested on April 12th. They arrest a reverend on Good Friday. All right? He will spend the next week in jail. And using tissue paper, using newspapers and little tiny bits of tissue paper, the jail janitor actually sneaks paper into Dr. King. King writes one of the greatest texts about American civil liberties. He will write the incredible Letter from Birmingham Jail. And if you've never read Letter from Birmingham Jail, you really should. And King lays out his argument as to why they are in Birmingham. And this is what he says. He says, look, King and the SCLC are not outsiders. They were invited to come. This is a non-violent movement. And there's a quote. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And he says, look, the waiting is over. The people who say, oh, you shouldn't do this, or we should go it slow with the legal approach. We cannot wait anymore. And this is one of the things that Kings point out, that the term wait has almost always meant never. After all, they've been waiting for like 70 years. And this is the other things King says as he lays out his argument. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And that's basically Henry David Thoreau's idea, taken directly from civil disobedience and put into Letter from Birmingham Jail. He says, look, yes, what we're doing is illegal at places, but we can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. All right. There is a difference between what is right and what is legal. And sometimes they are opposite. And this is the spiritual soul force argument that King makes, that segregation distorts the soul and it damages the personality. It poisons everyone, all right? Black and white alike. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and it gives the segregated a false sense of inferiority. And we're going to actually listen to a long excerpt from Letter from Birmingham Jail. But again, I'm always kind of uncomfortable reading King's words. And again, King has a voice like warm honey. Just listen to King himself as he gives a passage from Letter from Birmingham Jail.
I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are at present misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands.
Words like warm honey. And again, compare the Christian, nonviolent, American-loving patriotism of King to the violent, racist stupidity of Bull Connor. And King knows he's going to win this argument. King knows it because King believes that America is a good nation. But he also knows that the pushback by the racists will be severe. And it is. At night, the Klan moves in, setting fires, shooting at protesters, setting off dynamite bombs. Again, this is Bombingham. Several bombs explode in and around the city. They try to kill Martin Luther King at his hotel. They blow up his brother's house. They blow up the offices of the NAACP. And a few months later, at the 16th Street Baptist Church, they blow the church up. And 4 young girls are killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. The nation is horrified. President Kennedy directly called into Birmingham. He demanded the release of King. He sent 3,000 soldiers into Birmingham. The president himself, John F. Kennedy, began to openly speak of the need for a new major civil rights bill. But Southern Democrats announced they would filibuster any such law and not allow it to get out of Congress. But I want to point out the whole time this is going on, the whole time that King and the SCLC are protesting in Bombingham, this is not the whole of the civil rights movement. Nor did the different parts of the civil rights movement agree with each other at all. I mean, in addition to the NAACP, which is still in court this whole time, there were a lot of other things going on. There was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, who integrated lunch counters and restaurants across the South. They would walk into these segregated restaurants, sit down, and peacefully order a cup of coffee and basically await to be arrested or beaten or abused. And if they weren't, they just desegregated that restaurant. There were the Freedom Riders, who board these segregated buses and mix the races all in the bus and sing hymns and recite the national anthem. And again, it's incredibly wholesome to watch these young people doing this. Then there is the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, who went across the South registering African Americans to vote. And this is just some of them. There were, all of these different parts of the civil rights movements might disagree over the speed and the scale of the activism. And some of them even disagreed about the use of nonviolence, but they all agree that Jim Crow must be destroyed. But Jim Crow fights back. Buses carrying the Freedom Riders are shot at. They are bombed. They are burned. All right. SNCC will sometimes sit down at these lunch counters and be horribly abused. Have people flick cigarettes at them, pour milkshakes over their head, accidentally dump coffee into their laps. And then you can see right up above it, these non-violent protesters having to sit there and endure it, to be just like Jackie Robinson, while the racists surround them and abuse them. And those are the people who got off lucky. The members of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, there they are. Some of these guys are just straight up killed. There are 3 CORE activists who were registering African Americans to vote in southern Mississippi, and they just vanished, and their bodies turned up later, had to be investigated by the FBI. So there is violent pushback from Jim Crow. And as King and the other civil rights activists begin to make ground, as they start tearing down Jim Crow, the last bits of Jim Crow get very violent. Even Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King's strong ally in the NAACP, the field representative for the NAACP in Mississippi, the dude is murdered in 1963, just after the big victory at Birmingham. He steps out onto his own front porch and he's shot dead. Medgar Evers was a war hero. He'd fought the Germans at the Battle of Normandy. He was driving a truck in the Red Ball Express. The struggle was getting more violent with each month, and the gains seemed to be getting less significant. After all, President Kennedy had promised this big civil rights bill. I don't see no big civil rights bill. It's been hammed up in the Senate by the Southern Democrats. And so little progress was being made by 1963 that some people began to question King's tactics and question the movement's commitment to nonviolence. After all of these deaths, and after the 3 CORE activists were murdered in Mississippi, after Medgar Evers was shot on his own front porch, after buses are being set on fire, maybe violence is the answer after all. And there is a strong voice that comes out against King's nonviolent approach. And that voice is led by that guy right there. And we'll meet him next time. His name is Malcolm X. But we'll leave Malcolm X for next time, and I will see you there.